It's not 5 o'clock, and they don't care. Welcome to Wine to 5. Entertainment, education, and everyday drinking for everyday people. Your hosts are Valerie Caruso and Stephanie Davis, two wine educators who don't need a clock to know when to pour that next glass.
Are you ready, Val?
Oh, you know it, Steph. We're recording on a Wine Wednesday, or actually it's Thirsty Thursday, and we're putting our taste buds to the test. In this episode, we're drinking and talking about Austrian wine.
So I think we should just jump right into it because we thought it was Wine Wednesday, but it's clearly Thursday. So we've got that going for us.
Absolutely. We don't even know what day of the week it is, but what we do know is what's in our glasses. So I'm going to start with this Austrian sect. In and of itself is a worthy topic for another episode. Hint, hint. But this is the Steininger Gruner Veltliner 2013 Flaschengärung, Niederösterreich, Austria. It is a sparkling wine. So if you're wondering what all those words mean, Steininger is actually the producer. The Gruner Veltliner is the grape. The Flaschengärung means bottle fermented, and that is actually on the front of the label. And Niederösterreich is the region in Austria where this wine comes from. But that's what I'm drinking. It's a lovely sparkling wine. And like I said, it was a 2013. And it looks like, Steph, you've got a 2013 too.
I do. And I think I'm going to go about this the way that you did. So my 2013 bottle is Weingut Müller-Grossmann Riesling Kremstal DAC. So the producer is Weingut Müller-Grossmann, and the grape is Riesling. Maybe you already caught that. But the region is Kremstal, and that's spelled Kremstal. And it is a DAC, official DAC zone, which we're going to get more into that later, because this episode is part one of a two-part Austrian episode. So Val and I are going to dig into all of this Austrian confusing difficulty, German pronunciations, all of that stuff. But we've got some beautiful wines in front of us that are going to carry us through the show. I'm having to give a little premature shout out here because Supermarket Liquors had a good selection of Austrian wines, and I'm very happy with the two that I came home with. The Riesling is really, it's unlike a lot of other Rieslings because it has some nice body to it and intensity. And you enjoy it by itself or with food, but it has some strength. And I'm like, why am I not buying more of this? It's like $22, so, it's not on the cheap, but it is a very classy wine. Very classy.
Right. So should we go right in? And guess what, listeners? We're going to spell out every single one of these words for you today. No, I'm kidding. No, we're not.
Oh, my God. But, sometimes when you're listening and you don't see it in front of you, man, you come up with all sorts of crazy spellings, don't you? I do.
You do. Your mind goes crazy, but we'll put them all in the blog where we like to put all the extensions of the show. So don't worry, you'll still be able to find this stuff after the show airs. And of course, there are plenty of resources out there as well that we'll give you. But you want to start with a little bit of the geography. Where is Austria? Who are its buddies, its nearby buddies, and maybe just a little bit about the different wine regions that comprise the Austrian wine.
Yes. So this might not be like super sexy, but here we go. Austria is surrounded by other major wine producing countries. Makes sense. It shares borders with Italy, Germany, and Hungary, just to name a few. But all of its major wine growing regions, there's four major regions, and they're located on the eastern edge next to the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and Slovenia. The four regions are Niederösterreich, which is also known as Lower Austria, Wien, which is also known as Vienna, Burgenland, and Styria or Steiermark. The most significant and furthest north is Lower Austria. I know, it's so confusing, but that is a reference to its location on the Danube River. Lower Austria is then further subdivided into 8 key wine regions. Among them are 4 DAC zones: Kamptal DAC, Kremstal, Triesental, and Weinviertel. This area that we're talking about, Lower Austria, is really the major dry white wine producing area. So you're thinking like, this is where a lot of Gruner Veltliner is coming from, Riesling. And we're going to break down those DACs in part 2. So you'll get a lot more information on that when we talk about laws and regulations and all that good stuff. But continuing on like our little geography tour here, south and east of Lower Austria is Burgenland. And this is the home of Austria's famous dessert wines and notable delicious red wines. I don't know how many people realize like Austria has some pretty good red wines. Mm-hmm. And this area's major subregions are Neusiedlersee, named after Lake Neusiedl, and Mittelburgenland. A key point about this area is the relatively warmer continental climate here. That's what really allows happy growing conditions for the red grapes. The lake, and lakes actually, add to the humidity to foster the botrytis for the special sweet wines Ausbruch, Beerenauslese, Trockenbeerenauslese, all of those goodies. Those are they're expensive, but they are so good. But Burgenland has 4 DAC zones too. So we'll go over some of that stuff and what those wines are like in part 2. And the other 2 major regions are Steiermark, which is otherwise known as the Green Heart of Austria. That has kind of a small percentage of wine overall, but a good reputation for quality Sauvignon Blanc. And they have their own DAC zone, so we'll go over more of that later. Lastly, and of course, the capital, the city, the wine appellation, Vienna. They too have 1 DAC zone, so then that's 10 total. We're going to go over all of that stuff in the next episode. Maybe we should go into the history because that's really important too.
I think we should. I think we should go into the history because we're going to roll on over to one of the most awesome regional wine sites out there. If you haven't been to AustrianWine.com, it is fantastic. We used it profusely for a presentation recently, and I go there often because they do update it, which is really great. In fact, last time I was there were only 35 approved grapes, and now there are 36, and that was only a handful of months ago. So they do tend to update, and they have a great blog, and you can learn a lot about these regions as well if you really want to geek out on them. The one thing about the history in Austria is while vines can be traced back to this area thousands of years ago, there were some significant impacts to Austrian wine culture that date back as far as 700 BC in Burgenland, Weinviertel, and Triesental. And then guess who comes along? The Romans. The Romans have had their fingers in most of wine and beverage history, it seems, and Austria was no exception, particularly with respect to the Danube River. Apparently, there was a ban on vines also in this region. I'm not sure who enacted the ban, but it was the Roman Emperor Aurelius in the 3rd century that said, no. And he sicked his peeps on planting vineyards in the Pannonian Plains. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the viticultural equivalent of dropping the mic. Then there was the mass migration over the 5th century, during which the vineyards were abandoned until viticulture was again revitalized under Charlemagne, or Charlemagne, if you're French, in the 8th century. But more advancements were yet to be made, and then wait for it, the monks. Remember the monks? The church always has much to do with beverage history, pretty much across the board. In this instance, it was the Cistercian flavor of monks that brought their grape-growing swagger to Austria by way of Burgundy, and from the 10th to the 12th centuries, it was actually during the latter phase of the 12th century that regular people like you and me were then allowed to play in the viticultural reindeer games by purchasing their own vineyards. So if we fast forward a little bit to the 16th century, otherwise this would be the War and Peace of podcasts, and you're welcome, to some Austrian first. So first, the first sweet wine from Burgenland was in 1526, back then called Lutherwein. 60 years later came the publication of the first German-language wine book by Johann Rosch. Another important first was the wine school Klosterneuburg, found in 1860. It is the first and the oldest school for viticulture and enology in the world, still in operation today, by the way.
Whoa.
Right?
I know. That's cool.
And Austrian wine law. This is where we're going to get a little bit more interesting because it was written in the 20th century, but it was the wine scandal of the 1980s that transformed the Austrian wine industry and the way their quality today is enforced. So let's get to that scandal.
Ooh.
For those of you that have been listening since the Romans, your ears are probably perking up at the word scandal, aren't they? Aren't they, Steph? Are yours perked up?
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't want a little wine scandal?
I mean, I think that's like in our DNA somehow. You know, it's like we can't help but want to know about scandals.
I know. I don't watch reality TV, but to me, a wine scandal, and there are plenty. And of course, Austrian had its own as well. And it wasn't actually a happy thing, but like I said, it did transform the wine quality revolution there in Austria. So what happened was a tragic attempt to gain profit and save a little bit of money by adding diethylene glycol to mass-produced wines. What this did is this prompted the establishment of the Austrian Wine Marketing Board to reinvent Austrian's wine image. But as a side note, you're probably going, diethylene glycol, isn't that found in antifreeze? Yes, it's highly toxic. It is found in some types of antifreeze, but it was thought that the wines would be made to taste sweeter.
Yeah, that's what I want to be drinking is antifreeze.
Yummy. Yeah, right? And this is not the first or the last wine scandal to rock the wine world, but it did make the top 10 in the drinks business top 10 wine scandals. And we will happily link that article up for you. It was about a handful of years ago, but while Austria's wine scandal was certainly a dangerous one, it did result in nobody dying. It was the Italian methanol scandal the following year that actually killed 23 people and hospitalized more than 90. And that's from the drinks business 2011. So there you go.
Jeez.
There you go.
Yeah.
But don't you think Austrian wine has just totally gotten past that?
Oh, yeah. They have done so much for their image. I mean, even over the last 15 years, they've just been working so hard to change, you know, kind of like that should be just a small thing in their history, you know, hopefully at some point, and people will be just talking about the really high quality wines that Austria has and how strict they are.
They are. They are very strict, and they continue to develop very unusual things in the wine world, which you're going to hear about later, and kind of taking steps toward unique DACs or wine regions and growing areas, and their wine styles in and of themselves are standout. But what is really interesting about modern day Austria, they do host Europe's largest wine school in Rust, which is called the Austrian Wine Academy, and they delivered the very first WSET Level 4 diploma. As you guys know, that is near to dear to my heart, but they delivered it in German in 1991. And that's just a little nod to the fellow wine educators out there that this today in modern day is one of the biggest schools in Europe for the WSET diploma. So I thought that was really interesting. But what about the grapes?
I think that's cool.
Yeah.
And I know this maybe is obvious to some people, but Austrians speak German, and there's no language called Austrian. Just so everybody know that, first of all. And second of all, Val and I do not speak German, and so we are trying our darndest to get these right. So we're just letting you guys know. It's almost like, you know, hey, we should probably have some kind of warning on it. So our German is put to the test today. But I want to move on to talking about a little bit overview of the grapes. There's 22 official white grape varieties and 14 red approved for use in classified Austrian wine. The indigenous white grapes such as Gruner Veltliner, Zinfandler, and Rotgipfel are special to Austria. But as you've heard us mention, international white varieties like Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, and Welsh Riesling play a significant role in the mix. And something key to remember, because there's going to be so many things that we're telling you, but one of the key things to remember is that 2/3 of Austria's plantings are white wine varieties. As for the reds, because of that, you don't see necessarily as many reds to choose from. But as from the reds, Zweigelt by far is king. But there are international varieties that have made their way on the list, and they're used a lot for blending with the native varieties. I want you to also remember, because this is like totally like a test question, that Zweigelt is a cross between St. Laurent and Blaufränkisch, which was also developed in the country of Austria, 1922. You know, some of those things are pearls that are key things to remember. But the wine styles, and we're going to go into a lot more detail in the second episode, but often you'll see Austrian wine compared to German wines. All right. And that makes sense. They do have a lot of things they share in common, especially some of the grape varieties and some of the label lingo, but a lot of that is also changing. Like I was describing the Riesling that I'm drinking right now, overall, Austrian wines trend toward richer, fuller-bodied, and remarkably dry styles. It's overgeneralized, I know, but that's just kind of how you can think of it.
Something that I remember trying to get my head around when I was studying Austrian wines for the CWE exam was the white pepper note in Gruner Veltliner. And
yeah,
yes, absolutely. And I always have, unless it's really prominent, a very hard time picking it out. Like I was literally putting white pepper in water and swirling it, trying to train my nose. How flippant.
Did that work?
No.
Did that work?
Hell no, it doesn't
No.
work. You know, I mean, I was trying to. I was studying Tim Geiser's tasting philosophy, which did help me a bunch. I mean, his philosophy totally helps me get through the CWE and even the diploma. But I was doing everything I could to try to train my nose to pick up that white pepper, and very seldom, some people don't pick up those, what are those rotundones? We're rotundome deaf or rotundome blind or whatever. But that is a signature aroma of the Gruner,
Yeah.
which by the way is about a third of the total plantings. But we'll get to a little bit more of the styles and the different areas and what Steph was calling what is a DAC. We're going to talk about that in part 2 of our Austrian episode. We're going to be dishing out details on laws, on labels, on designations, and on the sparkling wine like I have in my glass right here. So get ready for that. Maybe ask your wine purveyor for some Austrian wine before next week's episode, especially if you can find some bubbly. This sparkling Gruner I have is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So that's what's in store for next week. But for this week, I think I want to move on to the factoid, Steph. You've got a good one.
Yeah, I thought, there's a lot of different things. When you think of Austria, maybe you think of Arnold Schwarzenegger, or, you think of different people, places, things, things you've heard of. And for me, I was like, oh, Austrian crystal, right? Surely you've heard of Swarovski or Riedel. And so I thought, well, quite often I'm drinking out of a Riedel glass. So let's kick around this whole, where did Riedel get started, and how many generations back are we talking? So the luxury glassware of Riedel dates back to the late 1600s with Johann Christoph Riedel. He traveled all over Europe trading his glass until he was tragically murdered. Oh my God. I mean, that's a scandal, right?
More scandal. Yes.
I know. But it was 2 generations later that Johann Leopold Riedel made a fortune during the 7-Year War making glass window panes. And subsequently, he made major expansions to the family's glassworks. Well, then jump ahead to the 6th generation, Joseph Riedel, who was really well known. He had sons who eventually in 1895 registered the first Riedel logo. Then, unfortunately, things got really ugly with World War II, as you can imagine. And Walter Riedel, the 8th generation, he lost everything and ended up spending 10 years as a prisoner in Russia. And it wasn't until the Riedel's friends, the Swarovskis, eventually helped rebuild Riedel, and they started doing the glass works of the mouth-blown pieces, kind of what you think of today. So that was in 1956. But then the glasses that we know today is stuff that have all of the very specific shapes for wine. That was the brainchild of Klaus Joseph Riedel. He was the 9th generation. He lived from 1925 to 2004. So he really gets all of the kudos for what we know today of how the impact of the shape is on our alcohol perception. I thought that was cool.
That's very cool. Yes.
Yeah. So, and sometimes it just it helps to think of all of the things that put it together, like how important is Austria culturally, wine, history, all of that stuff. So speaking of, since I haven't been to Austria and now I really want to go, because even our patrons, Chris and Janet, they were supposed to go to Austria and they had to cancel their trip. And now I'm really itching to ask them if, maybe I can tag along on their trip to Austria. Because it is supposed to be, last year in 2016, Austria was named Europe's best wine travel destination. So we do have a few links on our Wino Radar section in the blog for the curious mind who wants to get over to Austria and do some wine tourism. But yeah, let's do some shout outs. Val, go ahead.
Let's do some shout outs. We've got to give a shout out to forvo.com for helping us get through the pronunciations. If you're studying wine, you've got to learn these other languages. You don't have to Rosetta Stone all up in there or Babbel or whatever it is you use, but it does help. It helps you write better. It helps you talk with a little bit more confidence. Even if you're a little bit off in the pronunciation, at least if you're trying, I think it helps solidify the information. It helps you learn. It's kind of like an active learning process. So we recommend give Forvo, FORVO.com. Yeah. They are not our sponsor. We just love them. And get a little help with the pronunciation because it really does help you learn the material better. That's really the only reason. Because if you don't sprechen, it really does help. Because I often save this region for last because all those letters together are so hard for me. And I love languages. I absolutely eat them up. But this is one language I have a tough time with. And before we get to Patreon love, I got a quick German language story. So I was at a market in Florence.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that the market was all Austrians. So I go to purchase this bread. It is this beautiful holiday bread. It's got dates and figs and all this thing. And it's something you have with a Vinsanto or an Ausbruch, which we'll talk about in the next episodes. It's called Klettenbrot, I believe is the name of this bread. And I go back the next day for more. My friend and I got some on the way home from school. We took it back to my little apartment in Florence. We ate it. We had it with the Vinsanto, 2002, Badia Colto Buono Vinsanto. And I went back for bread the next day. And I said, what is this bread called in Germany? They said, we're Austrian.
Oh, whoops.
They seemed so offended that I ended up buying an entire kilo of this bread. And that's a lot of flippin' bread. But, just double check before you assume people are from a place when they're not. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. But they do speak German there. But speaking of love, we're going to send out some love to our patrons who support us.
Yes.
We're going to start with our tenacious tasters, Jeff E. from the award-winning We Like Drinking podcast, Lynn from the Savor the Harvest blog, Sebastian from Sassy Italy Tours, Jen in Maryland and the world, David and Lisa in Illinois, and our It's Not 5 o'clock and We Don't Care listeners, Meg in South Dakota, Clay in Arizona. In California, we have John, Andrew in Aswani, Chantel is in Ontario, Canada, Mary Lou is in Pennsylvania, Kathy in Georgia, in Colorado, Chris, Janet, and Diane. In Illinois, Steve and Renee, Kathy in Tennessee, Ashley in North Carolina.
And our Tastemaker listeners, David in Scotland, Carol in Kentucky, and Karen in California, our newest patron in Santa Barbara. Thanks, Karen. And our Wine-tastic listener, Laura. So you can join our Patreon pack by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/wine25podcast. As a patron, you will be entered into our monthly drawing. You get exclusive content and you get swag too. So we are so excited to have a new patron, and we want you to connect with us in between episodes too on the social spaces at Wine25. And we also have a private Facebook group called Wine25 Community where you can get in on some of those conversations. And you can connect with Val on Twitter at WineGalUnboxed and as Vino with Val on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. And I am on the social spaces as the Wine Heroine. So until part 2, everybody,
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Wine to Five podcast. Be sure to check us out at Facebook/WineTWO5 and tune in next week for more fun and useful sip tips.